So in today's video, I want to analyze two of the pro-choice movement's most popular propositions and some conclusions which necessarily follow if we presume that both of these postulates are true. So the first premise is that life begins at birth. And the second premise is that abortion is strictly the woman's decision. Only she can decide whether or not to carry a pregnancy through to term. Only a woman can choose to give birth or not to give birth. Well, if we assume that both of these are true, what does that tell us? What do we now know? What can we learn from these premises? Well, if life begins at birth, then it is the decision to give birth which allows life to be created. And it is the decision not to give birth, to terminate an unplanned pregnancy, which prevents life from coming into this world. So, if we assume that's true, and then we assume the second premise, that only the woman gets to decide whether or not to give birth, what we know is that it is the woman's decision whether or not a new life is created. So men have now been taken out of the process of creating new life. We play a role in the creation of potential life through copulation, but when it comes to actual life, to the actual child, well, it's the woman who does all the creation. It's the woman who decides whether or not this life will be engendered. She might consult a man before making her decision, but ultimately he has no real role to play in the decision-making process. He has no authority and no pragmatic way of ensuring that his preferences are met. So, for example, if the man wants the woman to obtain an abortion, but she wants to carry the pregnancy through to term, well, she gets to do so, and his desires are completely ignored. Similarly, if the man wants the woman to carry a pregnancy through to term, he can't force her to do so. If she then chooses to obtain an abortion, well, she's going to choose an abortion whether he likes it or not. So the man has no authority in this decision-making process. He has been removed from the creation of life and the decision whether or not to allow this to take place. Now, men are probably going to be offended by this idea that they have no role in the creation of life. It does seem to devalue our place in the grander scheme of things. But some people are okay with accepting this conclusion. What's more relevant is that we now know that it is the woman who decides whether or not to create life. It is the woman who decides whether or not to allow this dependent to come into the world. And if that's true, we can combine it with another popular postulation, which most of us already agree with, to lead to some other conclusions. So let's take this and let's use it as premise number one in a second syllogism. Let us say that premise one tells us that a woman decides whether or not a new life will be created, that it is the woman who decides whether or not to create life. Now, our second premise draws from a popular notion in Western civilization. That is, that each of us are held responsible for our own decisions and our own actions. For example, you would not throw me in prison because my brother robbed a bank. You would not make me pay child support because my brother got a woman pregnant. No, you would go to him. You would throw him in prison for robbing a bank, or you would make him pay child support for these lives that he helped to create. Only we now know from our first syllogism that he did not help to create these lives. He helped to create potential life, and the woman chose to create life. So he had no role in the creation of life. Premise 2 states that we are each held responsible only for our own decisions. So, given premise 1, that the woman decides to create life or not, and premise 2, that we're each held responsible for our own decisions, what do we now know? Well, this leads us to the conclusion that the man cannot be held responsible for the decision to create life, since he's not the one who gets to make it. But nobody really seems to believe that this is the case. Pretty much everybody appears to agree morally, legally, and politically that fathers should be held responsible for their children. So morally, we condemn deadbeat dads. Legally, we demand they pay child support. And politically, we call upon the government to crack down upon them. Barack Obama, a pro-choice president, has stated that we must crack down on fathers trying to escape their child support payments. He and Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate for president, have both proposed that the government take affirmative steps to cracking down on men who attempt to escape parental responsibilities. Yet again, the father has no control over the decision of whether or not this life is created. Now, he might have some control over the decision whether or not to engage in copulation, but consenting to sex is not the same thing as consenting to parenthood. In fact, from our first syllogism, we know that while consenting to sex might culminate in the creation of a potential life, it cannot culminate in the potential or in the creation of an actual life. Only the mother's decision can create an actual life. Only a mother can decide whether or not an actual life will be created. So if we're each held responsible for our own decisions, it logically follows that only the mother can be held responsible for the creation of a new life. Only the mother can be responsible for the child that she chose to bring into this world. The man had no real role in the decision-making process. Therefore, he should have no real responsibility for the consequence of the decision once it is made. Whether the woman obtains an abortion or gives birth to a child is strictly her decision and therefore strictly her own affair. It has nothing to do with the father. This is the logical conclusion. If we assume the two original premises, then it logically follows that we should excuse fathers from their parental responsibilities while leaving the mothers of born children fully encumbered with the onus of maternal obligations. But of course, just as I said, most of us don't believe that this is the case. So there's a contradiction here. A valid argument cannot lead to a false conclusion. And you cannot maintain logical consistency while using an argument and then denying one of its conclusions. So, if we assume that both of these premises are true, and we use that as an argument for abortion, we must then also accept that fathers cannot be held responsible as parents. Yet again, we don't believe that this is the case. We must resolve this. So we must either deny one or both of the premises or accept the conclusion. We're not going to accept the conclusion. Therefore, we know that one of these premises must be wrong. Which one is it? Do men get to force women to obtain abortions? Well, no, that seems utterly disgusting. Most of us are against forced abortions, at least ostensibly. Okay. So it must be the other premise, that life begins at conception. Or, I'm sorry, that life begins at birth. And yes, that's completely true. We can demonstrate scientifically that life does not begin at birth. In fact, I've done this in a previous upload. Now, we can change it to personhood. We can say that a person begins at birth. But then we just slightly semantically augment the line of argumentation so that it applies to the term person instead of the phrase life. So we can say, well, only the mother can decide whether or not to bring this person into the world. Therefore, only the mother is responsible for supporting that person. Because, of course, we're each responsible for the dependents that we create. For example, if I got married to a young woman, convinced her to drop out of college and to quit her job, and then moved her out to the middle of nowhere, and refused to let her have a social life for 50 years before deciding I wanted to divorce her, well, then I'd be forced to pay alimony, because we now have an elderly woman with no connections to her friends or family, with no educational or professional experience, and no real life skills beyond being a wife. So I made her dependent upon me, therefore I'm obliged to support this dependent. But you wouldn't go to my brother and tell him that he has to pay alimony. No. We are each responsible for the consequences of our own decisions. So if our decisions create a dependent, supporting that dependent falls upon our own shoulders. Therefore, if we say that personhood begins at birth, we can attach this into our first syllogism, leading to the conclusion that only women can decide whether or not to create this new dependent. And from there, we move to our second syllogism. Because we are each responsible for the dependents we create, we know that women are the ones responsible for children, not fathers. Therefore, we must either accept that life and personhood begins at conception, that men have some say over the abortion process, that they can force a woman to obtain an abortion, or we must accept that fathers no longer have any moral, legal, or politically just obligation to support their offspring.